Aijaz, we discussed before that this was something which was going to happen, and it was already building up to some kind of an accord. This an accord the United States could have got long back. So there's nothing in that sense.
2003, Khatami offered basically the same.
Basically, in fact, a lower degree of enrichment than
right.
what they have
That's
allowed
right.
for now.
That's right.
So essentially, it's a change of U.S. policies towards the region. What explains this?
Well, the setbacks that the United States has suffered in the area, partly thanks to Iran. They went in there into Iraq, and they needed Iran to help them get a Shia dispensation there. And the winner of the war was Iran. They wanted to have a government in Afghanistan, and they could not get the Jirga to agree to Karzai, and the Iranis arranged it for them. They need Iran again now, both in Afghanistan and in Syria. So that's part of what it is. That the whole 10-year of policies that were formulated by the neoconservatives around the Bush administration are finally seen to have not worked. And in that sense, we can say that it is the Iranis who have stared them down. And they finally have had to recognize that you cannot invade Iran. War, in my view, was always an empty threat, and Iranis knew it. The real issue was sanctions. How far? Now, they were at a point, I believe, when they had to either escalate the sanctions to a point where number of countries, and I believe including India, but certainly China and Russia and so on, were going to openly break them. They could not get an agreement from major consumers of oil for any further escalation. And countries, including India, were already very unhappy about all the arrangements that they had to make over payments or withhold payments.
So essentially the sanctions regime, and this is really the US sanctions regime, it's not the United Nations sanctions.
That's right.
These are unilateral sanctions, they're illegal sanctions, they're imposed against what are the WTO agreement.
Absolutely.
So therefore, these are all illegal sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those illegal sanctions were coming to a head in the sense that any further escalation will lead to their breaking the sanctions, countries breaking the sanctions.
Yes, and you see, Iran not only did not give in on the nuclear issue, they defined for themselves what the limits of their own actions are, and they stayed within those self-defined limits. But most importantly, in Syria, the situation was that if Americans and Saudis and all of these people are going to give weapons to their side, Iran was going to go on giving weapons to Syria. So sanctions even did not work even to that extent of restraining what the Irani policy is. It is not exporting revolution as these Sunni Takfiri types are exporting revolution, Saudis and so on. But for a long time, they have a settled policy that they will draw the line on Hezbollah and Syria, and they drew that line. So it was holding on to that position, and the Americans had a choice. At this point, how do you escalate against, just as they had to step back on the question of Syria, because they simply do not have a consensus or agreement even of their own allies.
So essentially, further escalation was out, and if further escalation is out, and as you said, they needed the help of Iran to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan, at least with some of its, shall we say, army, soldiers and other things intact. If that was to happen, they needed Iran's help. So this was the situation that was there on the ground. The other part of it, and that's an important issue, that both sides have conceded very little except what is the end state. And the end state becomes very important because if you see, only $7 billion of sanctions have been removed, and out of $100 billion frozen of the Iranians in the various banks around the world, which people are not able to pay back, like India's oil imports and so on. So if you look at that, Iran has got not so much out of it, and the Americans have also got really less than what they would have got 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 3 years before. So both sides have not conceded much. But the end state is that Iran is now accepted, though the Americans are publicly denying it, have been accepted that they have the right to fuel enrichment, which is the basic.
Well, if the agreement says that they can keep their 3.5 limit, then it's written into the agreement.
And it also says the end state will be fuel enrichment.
That is actually a minor point. I mean, that is there. Iran has not conceded the basics. Iran has conceded a lot if you start with the presumption that Iran was heading towards a nuclear weapon. Therefore, all this talk, Iran has to do this, has conceded this, that, and the other, presumes that it was heading towards a weaponization. It was not.
It is America claiming victory in a war which Iran never fought.
Yeah, right. And sensible people can see through it. Okay, so Iran has not done that. Iran has taken the existential threat card out of Israel's hands. Israel can no longer go around saying, we are going to invade because we have this existential threat and they're building the bomb. America recognizes that they're not building the bomb and you can have an agreement with them. They've done that. All the talk of we are going to bomb Iran, we are going to invade Iran, real men go to Tehran and all that, there is an end to it. Okay. So, you see, the symbolic value of this is even greater than the substantive value of, how much this and how much that. Now, yes, we'll see what happens over the next 6 months. I also believe that we don't know, but, Obama has only 2 years left of his presidency. He is very much beleaguered at home in domestic policy. He has to concentrate on that domestic policy and not allow others to drag him into these unnecessary wars, Syria and Iran and this, that, and the other. So de-escalating all that. Moreover, I would say that first on Syria, but now especially on Iran, this is the first time that the US government, pursuing its own interests, has defied Israel and AIPAC. The slap in the face of Israel that they carried on direct, in-depth negotiations with Israel, with Iran, without even as much as informing the Israelis. So, in all of these ways, politically, it is a much more important event than, what levels of enrichment and this, that, and the other, and so on. That 6 billion, yes, absolutely, there are, actually scores of billions is still frozen all over the place. But you begin this process, new deals on oil sales are now in the works. The currency is, jumping and so on. So the effects are very good.
It affects really in countries like India as well, because we were having problems getting Iranian oil.
Correct.
Also getting insurance for tankers which would carry oil. It was sanctions were not really just on the fact that you could or couldn't buy oil. It was also on this kind of things. Yeah. But getting out of that, you made a very important point that this is the first time US has a policy which is not in alignment with what Israel wants, and this is the first time there's seems to be a clear breach between what the United States wanted and what Israel wanted the United States to do. Similarly, it seems the Saudi reaction to this has also been fairly negative, though not as public. And Saudi seems to be also gearing up for a different, saying publicly that they have a different position than the United States. They will follow their independent policy. But it's interesting, the Gulf monarchies, apart from Saudi, seem to be all talking to Iran.
Actually, in my view, those monarchies, first Turkey and then these monarchies, actually forced the Saudis not to take a much stronger public position, because the rumor has it that the Saudis wanted the Kuwaiti Prime Minister to go lead a delegation to Washington
against
it, and he refused, and UAE refused, and so on. So they found themselves very isolated in their own region. Let me also add that, you see, the alliance between China, Russia, and Iran is, in my view, strategic. Oil is a very big factor. If sanctions go, Iran can be a very big market for Russia and China to come in for redevelopment of Iran and so on and so forth. But the ramifications of the point I was making earlier, that Iran is not exporting Islamism. Saudis are. Qataris are. So the threat of Islamism that both China and Russia face, China on its own territory and Russia in its most important sphere of influence, comes from them.
Also within Russia, those small
within Russia, of course, but in that whole
Caucasus region, of course.
You know, it comes from them. Chechnya.
Exactly. Chechnya being the including in Syria.
Sure. And this is so that is a long-term strategic interest of that kind as well.
Against Takfiri Islam.
Absolutely. Takfiri and what amounts to really Sunni. You know, this thing about Sunni Shia, the one thing about the Iranis is that they have not played that game. They have not played that game inside the region. They were supporting Hamas. Hamas broke with them.
True.
So they were not doing Shia Sunni. And they were not exporting. These people are. So they are now being seen as the pariahs, especially after what they have done in Syria. So they are actually being seen by the Russians and the Chinese as, they may not say much about it, but it's quite obvious that they would be feeling very threatened by these people.
And considering what Saudi has been talking about regarding Chechen and their ability to control Chechens, even in the discussion with Putin and the Winter Olympics.
Absolutely. They had the temerity to threaten them with terrorism inside Russia of that scale.
And this is Saudi Arabia against Russia. They have some delusions of grandeur just because it's sitting on petrodollars.
They're mad. They can't even control their own friends in the GCC.
So this is in some sense comeuppance for Saudi Arabia?
In a very important sense, yes. I would say so. How far it will go, I do not know. I think there is a desperate kind of alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I would also suggest to you that I think that it is Netanyahu's extremism, both of policy and of rhetoric, and his actually threatening Obama directly, funding the opposition, literally. Romney was his candidate,
yes,
and saying all kinds of things that will make you pay, etc., etc. That extremism has, I believe, also played into the hands into this situation where, for the first time, a very large part of the U.S. administration began to say, well, our national interests are really different.
That brings out a very important question. There's always been this debate that is Israel lobby in the United States really controlling U.S. policies, or is it that interests of U.S. foreign policy and Israel coincided, and that is why this amount of influence which appeared to be completely out of proportion? Do you think finally it is clear that Israel was useful to the United States, that is why the alignment, or do you think that there really was a disproportionate APEC influence, Zionist influence of the US foreign policy which went against US own interests?
Well, they have always had a far greater influence in the Congress than in the White House. they have had a far greater influence on the electoral machineries of the two political parties through funding and things of that kind. That is real. That is very real. And they have similar things in France and throughout. That is real. So either or, I believe, is really wrong. Yes, I have always believed that the only truly reliable friend, long-term, historically reliable friend that they have in the region is Israel. Saudi Arabia, it's one coup away. You know, any of these regimes can go and some other kind of regime can come. Never in Israel. So in that sense, the relationship is absolutely symbiotic in that. And therefore, the US does what it does. But at the end of the day, what is, I think, beginning to happen is that there is now a very large US elite possibly in the defense establishment, certainly in the academy, certainly in the mass media, certainly in the universities, this, that, and the other opinion makers, who are beginning to have the courage to say that these are different national interests.
And the extreme Zionism which has taken charge or control of Israel, which is being termed as settler Zionism.
Settler Zionism.
Settler Zionism, which is really run from the occupied territories of the Palestinians.
From the colonies.
So that is also something which is not in the long-term interest of Israel, United States.
I don't like the term because all Zionism is settler Zionism.
That's why I said settler Zionism in the West Bank. I'm specifically saying that.
But, Likudniks, the whole lot. Israeli politics has shifted enormously over the last 15, 20 years, within a generation. What used to be sort of a minority fringe, a substantial minority fringe, is now sort of 70% or so, majority, overwhelming majority inside Israel. That politics has shifted a lot. And that also, the more level-headed people in the US establishment are seeing. That this is not something that is going to serve our interests. That particular kind of labor liberalism is what corresponds to our interest, not this Likudnik business. So there's that rift. And my sense is that this so-called public opinion sphere in the United States is a very major battleground, I think, for people to engage in. Because if that shifts, then the US administration would be much freer to pursue their own national interests, even when they're in disagreement with Israel.
Essentially, US pursued its national interest with some intelligence that would be better than really tailing behind the Netanyahu kind of extreme Zionism which is being exhibited in the region, which is actually unsettling the whole region.
Yeah, and I think some of this new sense that they seem to have acquired on the issue of Syria and Iran most recently is actually partly an index of the growing, crisis that some people are beginning to understand that your claims of omnipotence are just vastly exaggerated. You better, pull in the threads. So it's recognition also of weakness.
Thank you very much, Aijaz. We will come back and see how this negotiations unfold, because there's still 6 months of this hard negotiations to go. And we need to see how the realignments takes place in the region, which today seems to be in the offing, and acceptance of Iran as a regional player at least. That seems to be something that the United States has now conceded. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks. Bye-bye.